final words on reform. So we did not talk about Jane Addams, and we do need to. So Jane Addams sees this problem with settlement houses, and Hull House is one of those. And a settlement house is where women and children went, typically when they had nowhere else to go. And from my understanding, they worked kind of like a workhouse in London, where you would pay to rent a room and you would work during the day and then you would go back there at night. I think they were mostly for women and children. I don't know how many men utilize settlement houses. I don't have those numbers in front of me. But Jane Addams has a real issue with the way settlement houses are run. They're usually in less desirable neighborhoods. They are usually run by educated middle-class women, which is great, but the people who use them are not usually treated very well. And so she wants to fix this problem. She wants to make settlement houses more accessible, more useful, and help to clean up the cities. So immigrants typically use settlement houses at the time, and so they are going to learn in these places how to assimilate. They're going to learn basic education in English, reading and writing skills. They're also going to learn basic hygiene and skills that are needed to function in American society. And once they've learned all these skills, these settlement houses will help these people find housing and jobs. And so settlement houses start to appear in all of the major cities, but they're not the old type of houses where it was just women and children. They were treated poorly. This is more of a community fix. Later on, Jane Addams will help found the American Civil Liberties Union, and she ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1913 for her work on settlement house reform, which is, that's very impressive. So she works really hard to reform these community centers into places of use rather than places of disgust where people look down on them. We talked about this. Jacob Riis, another reformer, he writes about how the other half lives. He focuses on the poverty and living conditions of the working class poor in New York City. He works with Addams, actually, to increase public space, and they get a lot of parks and playgrounds built at the time, which is nice because there's not a lot of green space in some of these cities anymore. We talked about Frank Norris. He writes the novel called The Octopus, which is fiction, but is centered on the exploitation of the railroad industry over wheat producers in California, which gets people to focus on what's going on in these businesses outside of what the businessman is seeing. Ida Tarbell writes the history of the Standard Oil Company because her father was put out of business by the Standard Oil Company, and essentially she just calls out Rockefeller for all the things that he's doing, including that rigging of railroad prices and all the things we talked about in Unit 6. And a lot of people credit the history of the Standard Oil Company with the thing that pressures the government to break up Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Women are out here getting things done in the 1900s, you guys. Obviously, people start to be very angry at big businesses, and then we look for government reforms in something that you may not even consider today. Well, that's not true because it's been in the news a lot. Maybe you would, but in the 1900s, there were no food safety standards. And so Upton Sinclair is a writer who focuses on immigrant workers in Chicago's meat packing plants. And he writes a book called The Jungle. This book is based on what he sees in the meat packing plants and his own experiences. And he writes this book no holds barred. And a lot of people I'm sure thought it was yellow journalism, but everything he writes are things that he has actually seen. And a lot of people are outraged and disgusted, not about the working conditions, but at the food production, because he writes about how rats would fall into the vat and they'd get spun around and they'd be ground into sausage, or men would spit in the area that they were working and it would just get swept up and processed along with it. And so it's a really disgusting book. I highly recommend you read it. Upton Sinclair says, I aimed at the public's heart and by accident hit its stomach. But in the end, we got those reforms because the president is disgusted by this, and we are going to get our consumer protection laws. A lot of the stuff we have today, sell-by dates, best-by dates, expiration dates, those are thanks to Upton Sinclair, and like food safety standards. So Roosevelt orders an investigation of meat packing plants, and he passes the Meat Inspection Act, which says the government has the right to inspect and test food before it is sent out for public consumption. And they are going to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act, which requires ingredient labels to be on the product so that people know what's in their products. So the next time you're thinking that like, oh, the progressive era hasn't done that much for me. Well, my friends, without the progressive era, we would not have our food labels that we have today. And so that is about the end of our progressive era. We are going to see political effects and changes in the cities. Political effects, political parties become less important. Voter participation declines. Interest groups, trade, and labor organizations start to become more powerful. Cities are going to see some really big changes. We're going to get new building codes. The government is going to take control over water, gas, and electricity utilities, which is still true today. It makes things more affordable for people. We get sanitation like trash pickup. People aren't just throwing their trash in the streets anymore. We don't have tuberculosis-filled rivers anymore. We also get more transportation, subways, streetcars, stuff like that. And a lot of this stuff is progressive at the time, but it's stuff in your life that you probably don't even realize came from them. And we credit mostly 3 presidents as being progressive government presidents. Theodore Roosevelt, obviously, takes over after McKinley's assassination and passes what's called the Square Deal. Everyone should be treated fairly. Safety, happiness, and prosperity are important. There are good and bad trusts. And he actually goes after some companies for violating the Antitrust Act. So he becomes known as a trust buster. Once he leaves, we've got William Howard Taft. He is also a trust buster. He destroys Standard Oil Company. He passes the Mann-Elkin Act, which says the ICC can control telegraph and telephone industry. He helps pass the 16th Amendment for graduated income tax, raises tariffs, and fires the head of the Forest Department, which makes the Republican progressives angry. And then finally, we have Woodrow Wilson, who I don't really think would be considered progressive, but I'm not the one who puts these units together. Wilson is president after Taft. He is a Democrat from New Jersey, but just because you're a Democrat doesn't necessarily make you progressive. So he does institute many reforms, but he's also very against women's rights and the equality of races. So I don't know how progressive you can really be if you're against 2 major groups of your society. So I'll let you decide that one. But that is the end of our progressive political era, and we are going to go into, are you ready for this? World War I. I know, crazy, right? So I'll see you in Europe.